I never thought about it until we all said that.
Yeah, maybe. Just in case.
A little global. Does he also work in this international civil service?
No, he was with UNDP, but now has his own consulting firm, mostly himself. And, sort of expands and contracts as the work expands and contracts.
This is not a conventional. Really? It's new. Quite unusual. I think that's
Well, I'm sure they wouldn't. So you better get back there. Hi, I'm Bob Hathaway.
Hi, I'm Hashimoto. How do you do?
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting us.
I allegedly run this the Asia program, and so he works for me.
Some years ago, would you here when I talked in 97?
No,
You were here in
I came in
97.
the early 90s.
It's already out here. I can sell it.
That's right. Time to time, and delighted to have this chance to send out.
Hi, how are you? Hi. Yeah, well, you said everybody has Reagan did it, and Bush did it. Anyway, I've never seen it on the street. It's the first time I've been here. More than a couple of years now. No, 5. It'll be 6 years this summer. And I never worked with it, though. Is it number 2?
It's okay. No, I don't use it in the presentation. Maybe after the question and answers. I have a couple of questions.
It's probably a lot easier to work with.
Oh, the government?
You mean originally?
Yeah.
Do you need to?
No, no, I don't need it for my presentation. Yeah, that's I think.
I want to say hi, I'm Bob.
Thank you.
How you doing? Appreciate you being here. I throughout the Asia program.
I see.
She did all the work in order.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you for being with us.
Well, you can always get it back on our land.
That's right.
Thank you for coming.
Hello, everyone. So I would like to welcome you all here to the Wilson Center on this cold and damp St. Patrick's Day. My name is Amy McCready, and I'm a program associate here at the Asia program. And so I'd like to welcome you and also everyone who's going to be watching on our live web broadcast, which is going out to all parts of the world. Today we are going to discuss the so-called creativity problem in Japan. Of course, it is not only Japan that worries about encouraging innovation in its workforce. Most countries do, including, of course, the United States. And also, it is not a new thing in Japan. For example, Yukichi Fukuzawa in the late 19th century talked about the need for Japan to compete with other countries in the world and to be more innovative. So this is an ongoing story, and to do it justice, we have a panel here that has expertise in history as well as education, economics, and sociology. And over the past several years, Japan has worked hard to implement a number of reforms in both education and in the business world, and to encourage risk-taking in both the private sector and in the classroom. And our panelists will explain these reforms in detail. But one thing I would like to mention, I think that we should all keep in mind the long-term effects that this is likely to have on Japanese society if the reforms and the changes in Japanese society do occur. I think that, like ours, Japan has been changing at lightning speed, and there are no signs that the pace of change will abate. And Japan is, like other countries in the world, is struggling to prepare its workforce for these ever-increasing speed in change in the IT world and in the economic world today. So there's likely to be much dislocation in society, as well as new and exciting opportunities. So I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one, and without further ado, so that we can get right down to the important stuff. Our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Akiko Hashimoto, and she is Associate Professor of Sociology and Asian Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. She is interested in Japanese youth culture and in generational change, and has written numerous works on the aging society, on filial piety and the social contract, on the Japanese family, the disempowerment of youth, and other topics. And she has received an Abe Fellowship and is currently at work on a book on national identity and memory in Japan. She has a PhD from Yale, and she has also studied at the London School of Economics and the University of Hamburg. And she's going to provide the general introduction to the world that Japanese youth are facing today. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start by talking about a recent international survey that explored the state of entrepreneurial interest among young adults in Japan today. Japanese youth in this survey were ranked the lowest among several post-industrial nations in their entrepreneurial interest. And this survey, which was carried out by the Sogyo Venture National Forum in 2001, found that the entrepreneurial spirit was alive and well in many countries. For example, in the United States, 64% of the youths responded to the survey saying that they could see themselves running their own business, as did 71% of their counterparts in South Korea. By contrast, only about one-third of Japanese youth said that they were interested in creating or working in a new venture. And these results undoubtedly disappointed the sponsors of the study, who evidently hoped to promote these aspirations and ambitions. In another recent study revealed a similar trend, corroborating the observation that Japanese youth today tend to have rather limited conservative aspirations. In this survey, Japanese teens were asked what they would value most in their life when they grow up. Following family, friends, health, and money, the usual suspects, they ranked their dream, ranked number 8, work, ranked number 9, freedom, ranked number 11, and finally their lifetime challenge, ranked number 14 at the bottom. To the popular media, Japanese youth today are uninspired and even dull, something the media view with alarm. The message is clear. There's something wrong with these youths, and they need to be fixed. Moreover, it's not uncommon for them also to problematize Japanese youth for their deviant behavior at school and at home. For example, references are commonly made to bullying, to school refusals, classroom disruptions, teen prostitutions, family violence, social withdrawals, and so forth. But at the analytical level, some commentators have pointed out that youth today are experiencing a generalized sense of social suffocation and alienation. And that is the reason why their motivation and behavioral patterns are constricted, even though it's the young who are supposed to be the most energetic and fearless among us all. And in their observation, blaming the victim will not solve anything. It's more important to get to the root cause of the behavior than rush to temporary solutions. So what I'd like to do today is to probe some of what I consider to be the causes of this uninspired behavior, quote unquote, and the behavior that leads to the so-called problem of creativity among Japanese youth. And taking a sociological approach, I would like to focus on two issues. One, the problem of obedience and the generational hierarchy that stifles motivation and inspiration. And two, the problem of authority, the hierarchy of orthodoxies that stifle criticism and innovation. In other words, I want to explore the question of power and authority relations of the younger generation in Japan. And I will argue that no amount of social reform, of education, or of the workplace can have a lasting impact on youth's creativity if it fails to address these two issues. Let me put these ideas first in context. When Japan began a search for its new social vision in the 1990s, as the Cold War ended and the economic and cultural globalization intensified, it did so with the realization that the social institutions and the economic organizations that served Japan to Japan's advantage in the last decades are now outmoded and rapidly losing their relevance. The paternalistic and protectionist social, economic, and political institutions were now out of sync with the global realities that raised new and urgent demands. The ripple effects of the economic bubble burst in 1989 to 1991 were serious. The gradual breakdown of the lifelong employment system, which was the pillar of Japan's job security, and the gradual shift from a seniority-based reward system to one where meritocracy matters more. Social stability seemed threatened. And in this climate of uncertainty, discontent also grew in the middle class and among the younger generation. There was seemingly no more guarantee that life was always going to get better simply by working hard, diligently, long, and loyally. In the globalizing world of Heisei Japan, then, the urgent task was to re-envision and reform its social institutions. Specifically, it needed to transform itself from a society that prized planning, discipline, and certainty to one that accommodates flexibility, risk, and uncertainty. However, this in effect requires a remaking of cultural identity. On the one hand, it means revising a cultural preference for order and hierarchy that increasingly serves Japan ill in the global economic competition. It also means reshaping a cultural preference for the safety of isolation and protection that is no longer tenable in the increasingly borderless world. On the other hand, change means embracing improvisations, uncertainties, and mixing with unfamiliar people. Japan is already irrevocably swept in the tide of international economy and global culture. Although the myth of Japanese homogeneity has long been dissolved, a sense of threat about a growing cultural hybridization continues today. So when social reforms of this scale are needed, a call for a generational turnover would not be unheard of. The need for empowering the younger generation as carriers of social change and new ideas would seem relatively obvious. Yet it has received little attention in the discussion of re-envisioning the future. Historically in Japan, social order has often relied on diminishing the power of the upcoming young, successively in the interest of safeguarding the stakeholders of social power. Japan has effectively regulated the power and interests of the younger generation by assigning obligations and incentives to stay in their proper place. The ideologies of filial piety and of obedience are primary examples of these dynamics, as are the senpai-kohai dynamics among age grades. Such basic premises are not written in any legal document or in any book of moral instructions, but they comprise a powerful force of normative regulation. The ground rules of these conditions that privileges the older generation at the expense of the younger generation have long constituted the backbone of the patriarchal template in Japan. And if Japan is unable to alter the power dynamics between generations, I would argue that it remains locked in a deep social contradiction between attempting to move forward while at the same time holding back the creative power of the young that is so indispensable to that very process of moving forward. It's characteristic of this stalemate, therefore, that the Japanese youth have the lowest level of entrepreneurial interests among their counterparts in post-industrial societies. The continuing unwillingness in Japan to respect the power of its youth as a carrier of change is a major impediment to their creative energy and motivation, and a cause for their profound disengagement. The problem of disengagement is conspicuous in what youths do not do rather than what they do. In another international survey, researchers found that compared to Korean, American, and German counterparts, Japanese children are least likely to intercede when they witness bullying in school, for example. They are also most likely to have never tried to stop friends from fighting compared to those in Korea, the US, or Germany. What emerges from this kind of study is a picture of disengaged, apathetic, and indifferent children. They do not see the value of or the reward of rocking the boat. Furthermore, these children are not receiving much guidance and mentorship that would empower them to take such initiatives and to grow up with confidence. The same international survey showed that compared to parents in Korea, United States, and Germany, Japanese parents offered their children the least amount of instruction. A very large proportion of Japanese youth reported, for example, that they were never taught by their father or mother to be truthful. The disengagement of Japanese parents from their children far exceeds that of Korea, United States, and Germany. Japanese children learn far less from parents, siblings, and teachers compared to American children. Those who report that they have nobody to talk to or nobody from whom to learn values is considerably higher in Japan than in the United States. Now, one might argue that some of these comparative differences may come from the Japanese practice of privileging learning over teaching, but the reality of parent-child estrangement, I think, is nevertheless undeniable. So the control over the power dynamics between generations has played a significant role in Japanese society historically as a means to safeguard social order, stability, and security. Filial piety and age grades are examples that have served those goals effectively as a system of surveillance that reproduces obedience. Age hierarchy has always derived its strength at the expense of the young through the practice of disempowerment in exacting a high price from the young generations of Japan. The alienation, the apathy, the disorientation, and the muted anger of Japanese youth manifested precisely in these so-called malaise today stem in part from a continuing unwillingness in Japan to empower and respect its youth so that they may give priority to their own lives above those of the elders. Now, the premise that the state exercises considerable authority over individual lives in Japan also imposes another powerful contradiction that can paralyze a generation even as it seeks to move forward in society. Historically, Japan has used education as an apparatus to mold its citizens into useful workers. Education since Meiji Japan has been a means to an end in making such useful citizens. Since the end of World War II, when the occupation introduced the progressive fundamental law of education, education has also become a site of contention between progressive and conservative political forces. What seems to be a common factor between both the right and the left, however, is the assumption that the youth and children are malleable by authority. The task of educational authority, of whichever side then, is to dispense authoritative knowledge that is selected and sanctioned by that authority. Let me give you an example of the curriculum guidelines that lay down the content of educational policy every decade. When reading these guidelines by the ministry for the first time, the reader will probably be struck immediately by the paternalistic tone generally represented in the use of the imperative language in the guidelines. The premise behind the use of this language seems to be that teachers and students must conform to these guidelines regarding content, parameters, and depth. Now, state policy is about setting goals and also about laying down rules for other people to follow. However, to set down the rules for individuals to follow so that they will think freely is an obvious contradiction. Along these lines, the new education policy to foster creativity also assumes that it can mold human behavior, even though the very behavior it tries to mold is itself cause for stifling the act, is stifled by the act of the molding. In other words, this new educational policy is marred with contradiction. It attempts to prescribe creativity. It attempts to regulate the free imagination. It tries to enforce innovation and to set boundaries to free thinking. Another look at the ministry's curriculum guidelines over time also gives us clues about the paternalistic authority as the impediment to fostering creativity. In these guidelines, there is no mention of the importance of teaching critical thinking, questioning conventional authority, and challenging orthodox knowledge, all of which seem vital and indispensable to nurture, to empower, and to free the imagination. A plausible explanation to me for this omission is that the guidelines are premised on regulating and disciplining use, so that they may be modeled into an ideal model of use, without expecting that these goals themselves might be questions, that these goals themselves might be constructively criticized by the youth themselves. So the idea that the authority is to set the goals and the rules is problematic without the voice from the youths themselves. So in conclusion, I want to entertain the idea that the so-called lost decade of Japan doesn't necessarily have to be construed as a loss, but it can also be seized as an opportunity for Japanese society. Indeed, in the next decade, we may move further along the path of creating a society that is more tolerant of criticism, more tolerant of challenges to authority, and to empowering the youth. There are many steps that we can take to achieve this goal. Fostering emotional socialization at home and at school is one important step that we can take. Opening up job competition for people of all ages, genders, and ethnicities is also another step. But if I were to point to just one thing that we could do that might have a domino effect in opening the various areas that need to be worked on, I would say that we would need to foster a society that nourishes opportunities for people to have a second chance, a third chance, a fourth chance in life, even if they fail in their first, second attempts to succeed at work, to succeed in schools, to succeed in their careers. I think that opening up opportunities for lateral mobility can go a long way toward giving back power to the imagination of youth who are fearful of the dead end after they fail in the first round, whether it's in school or whether it is at work. And we need to create opportunities and give people chances for recovery. And to do this, I think it is important for us to continue to rethink the relationship between what is authority and what is obedience, and how we might undo the disempowerment of youth, which we seem to take for granted in Japanese society.
Thank you. All right, our next speaker will be Dr. Misao Hayakawa, who will talk more in detail about educational reform in Japan. And he is a professor at the Graduate School of Education at Nagoya University. And he researches the history and philosophy of education, especially the impact of John Dewey and other Western thinkers on Japan, and educational reform both in Japan and the United States. He received his PhD from Columbia University, and he was able to return to Columbia in the past few years as a Fulbright visiting scholar. So he and his research and his ideas have been very much at the heart of all the excitement and debate and controversy that have accompanied educational reform in Japan. And so we're very happy to have him here today. Thank you.
Thank you. My topic is concerning about the Japanese creativity and the present educational reform. And I'd like to focus upon three topics. I'd like to talk about the future of present educational reform. And two, I'd like to talk about a recommendation for the present educational reform. It means need for tougher standards. And number three, I'd like to talk a little bit about the future of our youth. And as for the Japanese creativity and the present educational reform, I have a basic premise. That is, high academic achievement has been and is a basis for creativity in school education and future workforce. And what is the key to promote students' learning and their achievement? I think the formation of basic forms of learning among students is really the key. As for the school, our educational school system, we emphasize the mastery of basic forms of learning, and it is the source of our creativity. In a primary education, we focus on the mastery of basic forms of learning, such as 3 R's, formation of homework habit, and formation of art practice, and etc. In a secondary education, students prepare for the competitive high school and college entrance examination. Through learning test-taking skills, they spend a lot of time for this kind of test-taking skills. They master basic knowledge and skills. This is really crucial for them, and it will be the basis for the future creative work when they enroll in college. In college education, this has been one of the most controversial part of our educational system. So many educators and politicians criticize that college is no more time for leisure. We require tougher standards for students, educators, and researchers. Especially for students, we require more assignments and study. By the time they graduate from college, they face a really severe actuality of selective recruitment procedure by industry and company. They are asked to what kind of learning they have mastered by the time they graduate from college. And my basic position is that basic forms of learning needed for further educational work must be constructed by the time students graduate from high school. Topic 1, I'd like to talk about the nature of present educational reform. The present educational reform is called the third major educational reform in history, following the first one in major restoration and the second one after the World War II. And present educational reform started in the middle of 1980s and continued to the present day. So it has a history of more than 15 years. Its orientation is toward individuality, diversity, and more discretion. And its motto is achieving excellence through deregulation and competition. And we found two major components in the present process of educational reform. They are the United States and China. It is interesting that there are so many surveys regarding educational achievement among three countries, Japan, United States, and China. But by this time, there is already a criticism toward the present reform. It is a warning against the decline of students' academic achievements in Japan. Also, there is a new conflict between among politicians, the one who emphasized the leeway in the present educational reform, and the other who emphasized standards in the present educational reform. And the main criticism is toward the Minister of Education's discretion and leeway policy. This has started during the early 1990s, and the pendulum of the reform swung from the basics to the individuality. And it continues to the present day. For example, 5-day work week study at primary and secondary schools started in 2002. And also 30% reduction of curricular content at the elementary and junior high school started in 2002, and senior high school started in 2003. This has been a really controversial issue for us educators. Some are really against for this reduction, and others are really for this reduction. It still continues. The controversy still continues now. And also, we introduced the new type of learning called experiential comprehensive learning, which started in 2002. This is only for 2-3 hours in a week, and it's not such a big amount of time. But this was also controversial at the time of implementation. Some educators criticize these policies as aggravating the declining students' academic achievements. And topic 2, I'd like to suggest some recommendation for the present educational reform. The present educational reform emphasized the discretion, freedom, leeway, individuality, and so on. But now we need tougher standards, which is really the foundation for the creativity in education for the future. Number one, I think we need more time for study to cope with the decline of student academic achievement. For example, let's take the result of international comparison of test scores. This is a result of a third international math and science study conducted by IEA. As for the math scores, Japan ranked third in 1995 and fifth in 1999. Our rank went down. And this was really surprising for many mathematicians, both at high schools and colleges. And also, during this period, United States ranked 28th in 1995, then 19th in 1999. The rank of the United States went up. It was a really interesting contrast. As for science scores, Japan's rank also went down during this period. There's another example of homework survey. According to this survey, we found that the United States and the Chinese students spend more time for homework. Let's see the figure. This is hours of homework for junior high school students in 3 countries. What is amazing is that average American students spend more time for homework. Almost 40% of them spend 1 to 2 hours a week. And also, surprisingly, close to 20% of Japanese junior high school students spend no time for homework. And as for senior high school students, the result is far more surprising. More than 40% of Japanese senior high school students say they spend no time for homework. I would like to say, there's kind of bipolarization among students. There are, a very big number of students who don't study at all, and there are really few students who spend more time for studying. So this is really surprising. Average American senior high school students spend more time for homework. Let's go back to the. So the goal of my recommendation is that we have to pursue higher educational achievement, and we have to seek for motivation for learning among students again. And we also need to introduce tougher standards for university education. University education has been criticized for many years after the World War II. We need higher standards to improve our university education and research. The Ministry of Education in the year 2002 and 2003, they launched a special program called the Center of Excellence Program in Education and Research. For example, a Center of Excellence Program in Research, the Ministry gave special grant to 113 research project in 2002, and the total amount of research grant is 150 million. And also in 2003, the Ministry gave 133 research project, almost the same amount of research grant. This was really shocking for us educators and researchers. Ministry of Education really evaluated what we have done in the past and what we are going to do in the future. And also the Ministry gave special educational grant to Center of Excellence Program in Education. The educational research grant, the amount of educational research grant is $100,000 per project. And 80 educational projects got this special grant. It was also surprising for us too, because this means that those educational programs which received these special grant is that their programs are really excellent. They really attract high school, future high school students. And next month, April 2004, we are going to launch new 3-year graduate law schools. Almost 70 universities are going to establish these three-year graduate law school. This is the first event in the history of our higher education. The goal of my recommendation is that to encourage colleges and universities to develop innovative and creative programs for educating competent scientists, professionals, as well as serious students. I have one worry about future workforce. That is what Dr. Hashimoto mentioned about our youth. We have an aspiration crisis among Japanese youth. Our youth are losing hope for the future. This is often indicated by many educators, sociologists, psychologists. And one of the problems is what we call increasing number of young part-time free workers, what we call free arbeiter, free worker. There are more than 4 million free workers. They will work as a part-time worker for several years, but their future is not sure. They will not get a full-time job after several years. This is going to be regarded as a social problem in our country. Another factor, anxiety, this is also mentioned by Dr. Hashimoto. That is the changing lifetime employment and seniority system in industry and company. This is also negatively affecting, the attitude of our youth. As a mixture of various elements, many young Japanese lost confidence in themselves. We may say maybe it will be the emergence of new lost generation. Let's see the figure. One of the survey conducted by Japan Youth Research Institute in 2002, they asked the senior high school students, do you sometimes feel I'm no good? And surprising degree, more than 70% of our youth answered yes or maybe. In comparison, 45% of American senior high school students said yes or maybe. This is really appalling for educators. So many of young people are feeling that they are no good. And also we have another problem of school refusal among younger people, especially for elementary school students and also junior high school students. And the number of those students who refuse to go to school has been constant for these several years. The number is over 130,000 for these several years. This is going to be another problem for us too. As for the summary, I'd like to make some suggestions for the present educational reform policy. Our educational reform should deal with such tasks. Number one, we have to solve conflicts caused by choice-oriented reform, which emphasize freedom, individuality, discretion. We need to reintroduce standards-based policies. Number two, we have to improve a bipolarization phenomena caused by leeway or competition policy in education. There is a kind of bipolarization among students. Those who have bipolarization between the haves and have-nots. Number three, universities should develop new educational programs to cope with changing employment system in industry. I would say educational reform in the next decade is really important. It is a new challenge for innovative and creative education in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker today is going to be Dr. Gerald Hane, who is Managing Director of Q Paradigm, a firm that facilitates venture business investment in the Japanese market. And additionally, he consults with the Japanese government on issues related to venture businesses and venture capital. So he has a really good vantage point from which to observe the leading edge of change in the Japanese business world. Formerly, he was Assistant Director for International Strategy and Affairs at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He has a PhD in Political Economy and Government from Harvard University and mechanical engineering degrees from Stanford. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. My topic is venture entrepreneurship in Japan. And after listening to Professor Hashimoto and Professor Hayakawa, you might wonder if that's possible. But it is. Two of the words here, Japan and entrepreneurship, often aren't associated with each other. And in fact, what I find in my work is a view of Japan that's similar to this one offered by the president of Adobe Systems. The risk-taking culture, which is almost a badge of honor in Silicon Valley, is not present in Japan. There's often a view that the consensus-bound deferential society and the strict academic system, or at least the old strict academic system, have created an environment in which it is impossible to launch ventures or to nurture ventures. And I think that view is incomplete, and that, in fact, because it doesn't consider all the factors that promote entrepreneurial ventures. And one set of factors that we find to be extremely important are the incentives placed before individuals and organizations to respond to entrepreneurial venture opportunities. We're finding the government and the business leaders have taken on this area as one of high priority and implemented a number of policy and business reforms to promote a much more active venture environment. And in response to those reforms, we're seeing a rise of venture entrepreneurship. So I want to cover these points and then, in summary, relate some observations back to education. First, if you look at the past century in Japan, in fact, there is a lot of entrepreneurship to observe in the country. And there were at least two waves of entrepreneurship, one broadly around the turn of the century and one after the Second World War. This is a list of some of the individuals who are very prominent entrepreneurs. And in fact, one can even argue that Japan is a country built on its entrepreneurs. You have here at the top, it's kind of hard to see these good-looking guys because I put a lot of them up there, but Sakichi Toyota, who developed the Loomworks company, manufactured textile manufacturing equipment, which became the leading textile manufacturing company in Japan, and then later had an auto division, which he spun off into Toyota Motor Corporation. You have Torakusu Yamada, who manufactured reed organs, turned that into a broader music company, and after the war used excess manufacturing space to start a motorbike spin-off company. Koikichi Mikimoto, who refined the art of cultured pearls. Namihei Odaira, who had an electrical repair shop in which he just worked on small motors, converted over to heavy power machinery and evolved his company into Hitachi. Kenjiro Takayanagi, who in 1923 was the first to capture an image electronically. It was the same year that the Russian immigrant at General Electric, I think it was Zvortkin, also accomplished the same feat. Tokuji Hayakawa, who had a metal buckles manufacturing company, then converted that into a mechanical pencil manufacturing company in which he has a number of patents, and then was the first to manufacture radios in Japan. And his company, Sharp, is named after his Sharp mechanical pencils, his ever-sharp pencils. Goro Yoshida had a camera repair shop and an interest in optics, and evolved that interest into producing a camera, Kwanan, which turned into his company Canon. Kwanan is named after the Buddhist god of mercy. He was a very religious fellow. But there are many others as well. I don't have here Konosuke Matsushita, for example, who many would first point to, who left his Osaka light company because they wouldn't manufacture his light sockets, started his own company and turned his light socket business into Panasonic Matsushita, or the Hattori family who founded Seiko and then Citizen. I mean, so there are a lot of examples, certainly in the early part of the century, of entrepreneurs that were very successful and laid the foundation for the economy. In the post-war period, there were also a number of entrepreneurs that emerged to success. And I didn't put their faces here, but Sony, Kyocera, Casio, Omron, Honda, and Hamamatsu Photonics. Takayanagi, who I mentioned, who was the who accomplished the electronic capture of image, founded Hamamatsu Photonics, which is a globally leading photonics company. But then what seemed to happen in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is that a different paradigm of economic growth, growth emerged. And it was a very successful paradigm of economic growth, but one in which large corporations were very dominant and industrial groupings were also dominant, and in which small and medium enterprises really had no role, and in which ventures really had no role. There was no need for ventures in that period. And as a result, the structures evolved such that they were actually quite hostile to ventures. Small and medium companies were just that. They were small and medium companies. They were suppliers to the large corporations, and they acted as buffers to the large corporations when there were market swings. So that was the paradigm that led to the notion of Japan as number one. But after Japan as number one, there was, of course, the recession. And so you not only have an economic downturn, but you have rising competition from Asia. And as business and policy leaders look at that, they realize that that it would be very important for Japan to get the most value out of its innovation system if it's going to remain a healthy economy and a competitive economy. Then they looked at the experience in the U.S. and the contributions that ventures have made in the U.S. over the last 40 years and gave priority to readjusting incentives so that there is more reason to look at entrepreneurship and venture enterprises. This is a summary of some of the significant measures in the last 5 years that have occurred to promote a more friendly venture environment. As you can see, they're very broad. There's a whole set of reforms under finance, reforms addressing corporate governance, reforms addressing technology transfer, and also addressing individuals. Rather than read through all of those, what I'll do is take it from try to explain the changes from the perspective of individuals and then of investors. From the perspective of and these reforms, again, have only occurred in the last 5 years or so. So it's really a dramatic shift in the environment faced by entrepreneurs in a short amount of time. So before the reforms, if you're looking at financing, the only source you had was family. You could try to get loans from a bank, but often that was very hard to get. After the reforms, families are still the primary source of capital, early capital, but you also have sources of seed and venture financing. Before the reforms, entrepreneurs had to take full personal liability. That means that if their company went bankrupt, that all of their personal assets, and often the personal assets of their relatives, were at risk. So you lose your house, your car, your washing machine, your dog. After the reforms, now liability is limited to the company. Before the reforms, no pension portability. Okay. After the reforms, now 401k-like pension plans are very commonplace, used in both small firms and large corporations. Before the reforms, no stock options for incentives. You're trying to pull people out of comfortable jobs, or at least large corporations. You need to offer them some incentive for the higher risk. No such incentive. Now, stock options are allowed broadly, both for employees and for consultants. Before the reforms, no assistance at university. If you're a professor, you have no assistance to manage your intellectual property, to manage licensing, to find customers. After the reforms, you have a sudden rise of technology, licensing offices that were authorized by law, and it went from 0 to over 70 now, I think, in about 5 years. Before the reforms, looking for office space, you just had commercial space. Now, there are a growing number of business incubators, which not only provide office space, they may also provide wet lab space for biotech firms, which is very important, and also general business services, business support services to help develop the business plan and the connections to grow the business. Before the reforms, it tended to be an environment of closed innovation systems. After the reforms, there's a trend now in corporations to look to open innovation, which is also a concept of popularity in the U.S. And before the reforms, really no mid-career hiring options with established corporations. So if your venture company fails and you're looking to take a breather between ventures, or you just want to go back to a more sedate life, that was almost impossible to do. Now, that's still almost impossible to do, but it's getting a little bit better than it was before. For the investors, before the reforms, they looked at a 34-year return on their investment. That is, they put their money in now, and 34 years later, they get a return. That's a long time to wait for an investor. After the reforms, there are new venture-friendly exchanges that operate much as NASDAQ does in the U.S., and so you can get your return in 3 to 7 years, which is which more people are willing to accept. Before the reforms for investors, no participation allowed on invested company boards. That is, you put in a lot of money, you have no ability to influence the management of the company that you've invested in. Now, board participation is allowed. Before the reforms, full liability by venture investors. After reforms, limited liability partnerships are allowed. Stock swaps were not allowed for mergers and acquisitions before, which is very important for ventures to get together, and now stock swaps are allowed. There was inconsistent, non-transparent financial reporting before. Now there's clearly a trend toward international accounting standards. And before, you could only really work with strategic investors, which is often hard. And now you have a rising class of independent venture capitalists. So these are just some of the changes. But as you can see from the perspective of individuals and investors, the changes are quite broad. The response to these changes has been all along the innovation pipeline, from the front end of the pipeline to the back end, and the front end being inventions. This is a graph showing the increase in national university invention disclosures. These are the reported disclosures. And you'll see between 1996 and 2002, there was more than a 7-fold increase, from under 500 to over 3,800 reported invention disclosures. Okay, now these are only the reported disclosures, and it's commonly thought that less than half, perhaps far less than half of the disclosures are actually reported to the university, because professors don't have to. And in addition, private universities account for 60% as much R&D in Japan as the national universities. So if you add all of that together and try to estimate how many invention disclosures there might be, you have the pink line in this graph, which shows the rise. And then you have the blue line above it, which is the number of invention disclosures from U.S. universities. And what you'll see is, in this estimate, the level achieved now in Japan may be equal to the level in the U.S. about 10 years ago. Okay, in a much bigger university system with a much longer history of research. So the changes, so that order of magnitude change actually is quite substantial. University spin-off ventures in Japan have also increased quite rapidly. In 1996, you had fewer than 10 university spin-off companies. 2003, 190 were found. And usually after they do these surveys, they find a few more. So that's about a 20-fold increase over that period in university spin-off ventures. You ask, who's spinning off these university ventures? Are they just trivial hobbies coming out of universities you haven't heard of? And the answer is no. They come out of the major universities in Japan. You see that Waseda and Keio universities, the 2 leading private universities, spin off a lot of companies, first and third in this survey. Tokyo, and then the old imperial universities and national universities, Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, Tohoku, also spinning off a lot of universities, spinning off a lot of companies, as does the Tokyo Institute of Technology. These numbers are from about 2001, I think, to now, the cumulative. And then you might ask, well, are these companies nonetheless sort of service-oriented companies by a bunch of college kids? And the answer to that is also no. That if you look at the sectoral diversity in these companies, it's actually quite reasonable and diverse. You have about a third of these spin-off companies in information technology, hardware, software, more in software, about a quarter in biotechnology and medical devices, about a fifth in machinery and materials, and 5% in the environment. There's another law that passed just a year ago, which allows companies to form with minimum capitalization requirements. Previously, traditionally, one needs 10 million yen, or about $90,000, to establish a company, and that was changed to 1 yen from 10 million. And since that law was passed, you see the rise in the number of companies registered. This is cumulative, so that in about 11 months, you have over 11,000 companies that have applied under this new system, and about 8,000 that have been approved or established. And then only about 3% are actually 1 yen companies. The others are not. And after 5 years, they actually have to show growth and normal capitalization. Then this simply shows the rise, the improvement in the infrastructure. These are business incubators that are available to venture companies. In the 80s, you see there are virtually none forming each year. In the 90s, you see 5 to 10. In 2000, there were 60 that were formed. Now, granted, these are public and private, and granted, the private's probably dropped off since the internet bubble, but the prefectures and local governments and universities still seem to be quite active in promoting that, continuing to develop that infrastructure. And then the initial public offerings, the IPOs in Japan, down from the peak in 2000 of 160, but holding steady in 2002, 2003 at 100, and 2004 estimated to go up to 130. That compares in 2003 with the U.S. and NASDAQ, in which there were 22 venture-backed IPOs. So who's bringing this to you? Here are some examples of the new age entrepreneurs. Very quickly have Mikitani from Rakuten, a virtual marketplace, Hori from Globus being a mid-career management school, Morishita from Angis, the first biotech IPO in Japan, Izuka from Thine, a system LCD company with 70% of the world market share in LCD drivers. Makino from Works Application, leading enterprise software company, and Senmoto from eAccess. He's an older-looking guy here, but he is actually a serial entrepreneur. He established DDI in the mid-'90s, Japan's first independent phone company, about 1984, and then established eAccess in '97. And they actually had an IPO just a few months ago that was very successful. And the one without a picture, Oncotherapy Science, I put up there simply because I don't have Tomita's picture, but that was the biggest biotech IPO of 2003 in the world. It had a $1.2 billion capitalization when it came out. Well, let me go back to this. What I want to do now is sort of segue over to a quick discussion of links to education, and in particular talk about one aspect of education that seems to be very important in promoting venture entrepreneurship, which is diversifying one's perspectives. That is, removing one's mind from the existing conventional confines and looking at issues and opportunities in a new way. And this is the notion as offered by Nicholas Negroponte, the co-founder of the MIT Media Lab, when he said, our biggest challenge in stimulating a creative culture is finding ways to encourage multiple points of view. Many engineering deadlocks have been broken by people who are not engineers at all. This is simply because perspective is more important than IQ. Similarly, when I talked to an award-winning young scientist from one of our international research programs, the Human Frontier Science Program, she offered the view that many scientific breakthroughs simply come from looking at old problems in new ways. Old problems from a different perspective. It looks like I'm running out of time, so I won't go. Just very quickly, if you look at the first two individuals here, Mikitani and Hori, their change in perspective was when they came to the U.S. for business school. They both had very good track careers in their corporations, Industrial Bank, Sumitomo. They came here and found that their colleagues at the Harvard Business School were not aspiring to use their MBAs to advance back into corporations, but to start new jobs, start new companies. Mikitani went back, started Rakuten, in which he said no one believed, only he and his partner, and which many actively dissuaded him from pursuing. It's now a $7 billion company. He owns 60% of that company. And he said, I went from being a salaryman to a billionaire in a few years, and it wasn't that hard because there isn't that much venture competition in Japan. Hori as well followed a similar path, a similar inspiration with partners, was down to his last investment, he says. They took out a full-page ad in the Nikkei about his management school, went to work the next day, got enough calls to enroll 25 students. Now they have over 3,000 students in his school, and he's a full-time venture capitalist. Another observation about the change in venture in the entrepreneurial environment is that there may, in fact, be a feedback from this environment of entrepreneurial innovation back to promoting changes in education, or back to education, and back to societal expectation, so that it promotes more supportive expectations and more supportive structures to further promote innovation. Because there's a need here that people are responding to, and people will move to that need, and maybe that will feed back to help shift education and societal views in a positive way. Came up this way. As observed by an old economist, that when you're looking at economic growth, the difficulty often lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. And this is John Maynard Keynes in 1936. So if Japan, in fact, is able to continue to follow this path toward a more vital entrepreneurial environment, then one may see a shift in the view of the Japanese salaryman from the 1980s view of the 10-foot-tall salaryman in Japan as number one to the 21st century 10-foot-tall Japanese entrepreneur. Okay. That's it.
Thank you. I know a lot of you in the audience are probably thinking you would like to get some of these slides, and if you just let me know, send me an email, we can get you these slides from these two last presentations. And also, there will be a special report coming out with essays by all three of the speakers. Okay, our last speaker tonight is Dr. Ann Imamura, who will be offering comments on the previous three presentations, and has the job of tying all of this together for us. And she is familiar to many of you in the audience, and she is a good friend to the Asia program and to the Wilson Center. She is Area Studies Division Director at the Foreign Service Institute at the U.S. Department of State, and she is also an adjunct professor of sociology at Georgetown University. And her expertise on Japan includes gender issues, urban society, and social change. And her books include Reimaging Japanese Women and Transcending Stereotypes, Discovering Japanese Culture and Education. She has a PhD in sociology from Columbia University. And unfortunately, she has to leave just a few minutes early tonight in order to go teach a class. So if she bolts out of the room, that's the reason.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with your questions. Well, as I'm sure everybody in the audience knows, we've had three excellent presentations. And as I was reading the papers in advance of this afternoon, it occurred to me, or my focus was, that these three presentations focus on a universal question that basically in the high-tech, high-speed, globalizing context of the 21st century is becoming increasingly important. The question of how to create space for creativity while being accountable. Everyone in this room can, I'm sure, think of examples of the individual who didn't fit the mold, who failed or who barely graduated from the school system, who was the black sheep of the family, who couldn't hold a job, and who went on to make amazing contributions because of his or her creativity. What none of us knows is how many people were squelched by the system, unable to find a patron or sponsor, or unable to continue to foster their creativity by working jobs that took care of food, clothing, and shelter, so that during their evenings and weekends they could follow their passions. At different points in history, as we all know, the wealthy and the powerful served as patrons for the creative, and in many cases shaped and controlled the boundaries of that creativity. In more recent times, public, semi-public, or private institutions and foundations took over this role, providing grants or startup money to those who met their criteria. All of these contributed to developing and to maintaining creativity, but each had its standards, focus, rules, which shaped the directions and the limitations of creativity. In contrast, something like the MacArthur Fellowship, in fact it's the only example I happen to know, is completely free in the sense that the recipient can use the money for whatever he or she chooses. On the macro level, we see the interplay of social institutions, the definition of the identity of the society, and the changing conditions, political, economic, and social, that occur independently of the existing institutions and that in turn impact them. You've seen examples of all of this in the presentations today. Today's papers reflect how both international and domestic issues led to reforms in the Japanese system of education and a rethinking of those reforms, to apathy among Japanese youth, and to changes in the business structure that should, will, or have fostered entrepreneurs, and that may in turn impact education, the family, and other institutions. In reflecting on these papers, a number of questions come to mind. Issues for Japan, but also much broader than Japan. In my following brief remarks, I'll use the term society rather than nation or country, because I don't want to really get into the debate here over globalization versus internationalization, the future of the nation state, and whether we're talking about an entity larger than that state or not. To go back to my original question, how does a society foster creativity while retaining accountability? We can ask to the presenters this evening, and as we discuss this issue ourselves, how much space should be left in the education system? How soon can the results of education reform be measured? It can take decades to see these results. How long can or should a society wait? Perhaps 34 years, like the investment that Dr. Hane mentioned? To me, this issue requires, as we look at the issue of education, requires the willingness to take risks, to invest in multiple programs, and to let these programs play themselves out. A second issue that underlies the presentations, but really wasn't the specific focus of any one of them, is how in the 21st century do societies motivate the middle-level child, or the middle-level adult for that matter. If school systems pay more attention to children at both ends of the learning curve, what we call the gifted and talented here, or those children who need extra help, those children on the gifted and talented end who would become students in some of the new schools that were described, where does the middle child fall? Below the gaze of the teacher, below the gaze of the system, below the gaze of the parent? The good kid, who everybody thinks will be all right. Perhaps it was true that the good kid would be all right in Japan through the economic bubble. But it's not so true today. At least it's not necessarily true today. The middle-level children can no longer look forward to a secure future with a company or security in the family as a homemaker or as a senior citizen in that family. Nor can they look forward to security in their old age, being cared for by their children and relying on pensions. If societies do not motivate their middle-level children and their middle-level citizens, the potential for apathy increases, and so do social problems. And in the context of today's panel, this lack of motivation provides a drag on creativity and on the entrepreneurial spirit. The challenge, then, is to provide an environment which nurtures these students or citizens and encourages them to be creative, entrepreneurial risk-takers. Given that ventures are, by definition, risky, and given that many of the security blankets that worked in Japan through the bubble are no longer there, and given the development of the Frieder phenomenon, what can or should be done to provide an environment that will allow, as Dr. Hashimoto mentioned, failure and learning from failure to go on to new ventures? This is important both domestically and internationally. A society must be able to develop a milieu in which risks can be taken without leaving the failed risk takers a permanent cost to the society. This, it seems to me, is one of the major challenges of the current times. If the Japanese household can no longer take in members who suffer adversity, if the Japanese employment system can no longer offer predictability until retirement, and if the world is not looking for immigrants from Japan, where will the risk takers go for food, clothing, and shelter? And where will they be when they reach retirement age? Professor Hayakawa talks about creating communities of caring and learning, and his concern about the polarized society and the need to protect our egalitarian tradition. Professor Hashimoto talks about new social visions that must be chosen by individuals, And Dr. Hane talks about incentives, creating a new entrepreneurial class in Japan. The challenge for Japan, and other societies as well, is how to create an environment that nurtures all of these, and how to avoid letting definitions of society, goals to motivate the young, and visions of security that are no longer viable hinder or weaken the creativity that is developing and needed today. And I hope during the discussion that follows, we will pick up on some of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move on to question and answer period. So we do have microphones to pass around, and I ask you please to identify yourself and please be brief and to the point, and our panelists will do the same. Thank you. Yes, here at the end.
Hi, I'm Naveen Rao with the Federal Aviation Administration, and my question is for Dr. Hane. You mentioned that in two periods of Japanese history there was quite a bit of entrepreneurship, the turn of the century and right after the war. What was it about those periods that sort of made it fertile ground for the entrepreneurial spirit, and how do you think that could be recreated?
Oh, well, economic disarray. I mean, in the turn of the century, you're coming out of, it's in the Meiji era, you're coming out of a period of semi-isolation. And so there aren't structures that get in the way of entrepreneurs, and aren't social expectations that get in the way of entrepreneurs. Similarly, after the war, you have a lot of economic disarray, and so individuals have some flexibility to go pursue their own interests. When these structures of economic success developed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that's what really squeezed out the incentives to be entrepreneurs. I mean, it would have been a very poor decision to become an entrepreneur in that period unless you're extremely brave or innovative. And that's been recognized, and so they're trying to reform policies and business practices so that they remove those disincentives and create positive incentives for entrepreneurs, and you can see that they're stepping toward doing that. Obviously, other things need to change. You need feedback to society and education, but there are certainly positive signs there.
Thank you. Okay, here.
Thank you very much. My name is Takenaka, Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi. Yeah, I completely agree with the criticism on the authoritarian and too much standardized Japanese education system today and in the past. And probably I am the one who survived such an authoritarian education system. But however, my question is, if there is a kind of a trade-off between the average knowledge or skills of people, students or workers, and creativity. Well, and I think a Japanese system is rather good to increase the average knowledge or skills, while it depresses somewhat creativity. On the contrary, I think the American system is not so good to increase the average, while it provides more favorable environment those who seek creativity. So, for example, if we buy home electronic appliance made in USA, 1 of 10 will be broken soon. Or unfortunately, it is not workable from the first time. But such a thing is unbelievable in Japan. So I think we understand the essence of this problem on such a trade-off. And of course, I don't think that the current Japanese position on this trade-off is. I don't think it is good, not at all. Of course, we have to move more creativity, avoiding decline of average. So anybody is all right. Thank you.
Yes, who would like to comment?
Yeah, maybe I'd like to say some comments. I just mentioned the importance of formation of basic forms of learning. We say form in Japan. We emphasize that concept very much. For example, the form of judo, Japanese fencing, Japanese archery, we always emphasize pattern or form. It is applicable to everyone, anyone. so that everybody can participate in learning that form. Even at the elementary school education, teachers emphasize such kind of invention of such kind of forms, learning, memorizing mathematics multiplication form by memory, or they shunt together. Such kind of invention of unique forms is really important and also basic to our education. And most of us are really trained to master such kind of basic forms, and they spend more hours learning basic forms, and they develop their own original form through spending a lot of time. That's why I think that's the basis of our ingenuity, or another way of expressing our creativity. So when you mentioned about our mechanical or electronical product, some of them are really highly of high quality, and we spend so many hours spending to fix such kind of devices and machines. So I'll say the creativity and basic knowledge are different. Spending a lot of time for mastering basic knowledge will sometimes lead to the beginning of creativity or ingenuity. That's what the basis. That is the basis of how to say ingenuity-oriented Japanese culture. The word engineering and ingenuity, they share the same origin. Ingenuity and engineering, we can find a similar element. That's really the source of creativity, I think.
Thank you.
Maybe I can also address that the question of trade-off is critical and also very important. And whenever I think of issues that seem to force us to choose, I also wonder whether it would be possible to have some kind of hybrid system that allows for two polar opposites to somehow be merged into a new third form. Whether it is the conflict between standard and leeway, is it possible to not just choose one over the other, but to have some form in which it is the two are mixed? And I think that in the case of Japan, given that Japan is not a Western society, does not come from a Christian culture of individualist competition, the hybrid form is going to be what we're searching for. As I was thinking about the question of creativity for this panel, I was just reminded of this particular school in Japan, which has a very long history of being a very liberal experimental school. It opened about 100 years ago by a very innovative educator called Yanagisawa, and I happened to go to that school, so I remember a whole lot that we didn't have report cards, we didn't have tests in schools. We had play time, we had sculpture time, we had time to go and play in the fields, and we also didn't have hierarchy between us and the teacher. There was an open door to the teacher's room, and we didn't have to bow to go in there. Now, I also remembered that even though there was this atmosphere, we were also expected to respect the founder, whose bust was there at the entrance of this very big school that went from a kindergarten to university. So while we were in this very liberal, experiencing this liberal education, we were also bowing to authority at the same time. And this is a kind of hybrid. It's not either or. It's a mixture that exists and has existed for a long time. And I think this is possibly the direction that we could be seeking, because if we are stuck between either or, we could be stuck for a very long time. And so maybe that's where we could also be creative in thinking about future direction.
Okay, I think the next two questions were right here in the middle.
Thank you. Shio Sakai from the Mansfield Foundation. And my question is about the college situation in Japan. And I guess maybe Professor Hayakawa and Professor Hashimoto can answer that. Professor Hayakawa briefly talked about how like Japanese college students don't study and like all that kind of like stuff. I said stuff, but and you also mentioned like how the Monkasho or like Ministry of Education try to enforce some kind of rules about or like the regulation type of activity. They try to make those students study harder, but I guess the problem is like the Japanese college student just simply lacks the incentive to study hard, precisely because of the Japanese corporation hiring practice. And like just to give an example, I mean, I guess you're more familiar with me, but like for me, if I'm gonna be working from next April, I should be almost getting some job by now, and that also kind of means that those corporations really don't care about what you study in school. Rather, they just see you. And especially when you're like non-science, like so-called bunkei type of people. And I was kind of wondering, what do you think about that kind of point? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't mention in my presentation about the lack of motivation among Japanese college students, but I mentioned it in my paper, so you can read it after. And it is really a cultural revolution in our country. I think to university. I emphasize the importance of university reform. It is mainly because it's like a cultural revolution. For example, for an average Japanese college student to spend more time for study, it is really a revolution, Since, as you mentioned, those students enroll in humanities and social science, they are not required to study hard. They are not required to spend more time for reading assignments and so on. But now, from this April, national universities are going to be national university corporations, and each university should be responsible for education of their undergraduate students and graduate students. And after 5 years, we're going to have an external evaluation. And even those who will evaluate our educational program, research programs, are really afraid of doing that. And every professors really, and also administrators, are afraid of this external evaluation. But students are the only exception. They don't worry about what's going on after this April. They feel that they can continue their own, culture as far as it goes. But we are not sure. So what I'm saying that, this reform is not only important for educators, researchers, and administrators, but also for students. After corporatization this April, students are required to spend more time for their own study, and we are responsible for creating, accountable educational programs for them. So maybe within 5 years, the culture of university will be changing, I hope.
Yes. You had your hand up before. Yes.
Kuniko Nakamura. I'm currently in the mid-career program at the School of Advanced International Studies. And I'm also experiencing a cultural revolution, having to study and go back to graduate school after almost 10 years of professional experience in Japan. And I also benefited from not having studied, gotten my education in Japan until I went back to Japan for university and went to a very conservative mainstream university. And now I feel I'm almost being punished for taking the risk to go back to school. I'm graduating in May, and I am also a social science major in international relations. And if I can't be a good example, who can be for people in a new education system in Japan? And how long do I have to wait? I'm sorry, it gets very personal here.
Are you in the PhD program?
I'm in my mid-career master's program.
Master's program.
How long do you have to wait for what? To get a job?
To get a job and for society to change, for us social science students to be able to laterally move.
Laterally move.
Ah. That's a really tough question. Can't predict. Well, but you already have master's degree, right?
Will.
You will. Well, that's another problem. One of my students enrolled in the master's program at New York University, and she's almost finishing her master's and looking for jobs. And she said she can't find it even in New York area, or when she goes back to Japan, she can't find one easily. That's mainly because she had an work experience before, and most of the Japanese companies do not want to hire mid-career, workers, and that's one of the reasons. Another problem may be a gender issue, gender discrimination. So I can't tell exactly how soon you can get a job, but because of this economic recession, many mid-career people find it difficult to get a job for the present time.
Start a venture.
Right. Start a venture.
I think that the two questions are related because it's about hiring practices in Japan and the closeness of the job market for anybody who is off track or off time, not available at age 22 from a particular good university, preferably Nagoya University, and if we can spread that to the late 20s, the early 30s, heaven forbid 40s, I think that will go a long way toward, first of all, integrating women into the job market at mid-careers, because that's the time when women may want to come back to the job market after marrying, having children, and so forth. Not that we necessarily expect that is imperative. And also by whether or not you want to study at age in the fourth year in college, being hinged on the hiring that takes place in the following April is another example of how narrow that window is. If you are thinking that perhaps that might be your first job, but perhaps in 5 years you might go to another job, you'd be thinking, hey, I'm going to be better off learning some practical skills here or something like that. It's because you think of the hiring as a one-time chance, that there is all kinds of problems arise. I think the examination hell also arises, and I'd be interested to hear your view. If people had more chances to be hired at different times in their mid-career, I think the examination hell will also change reduce its intensity. So I don't have the solution to solve this overnight, but clearly that is the key to a lot of the problems that I think are related in Japanese society. And we just need to keep on pushing the doors and spread our windows, open the market to outside, and take advantage of a increasingly borderless job market.
Thank you. Okay.
Sorry, the fact that my question was also, I think I had all the education that you were advocating, but it's not working. It's also, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be a devil's advocate, but how do you address that issue?
Overeducation. Well, actually, it depends on what kind of jobs you're looking for. If it leads to kind of career, then you can pursue it. We don't care about age. Now, for example, National University has a kind of affirmative action policy toward female scholars and research educators. For example, by 2010, we have to employ 20% of our faculty member to be a female. And average national universities, national female faculties percentage is almost 6-7%. So we have to fill this gap within several years. If you pursue master's degree or doctoral degree, you can get a job in education research. Well, there are some areas where you can look for.
Okay, let's go back to the questions here in the middle.
My name is Bert Ely. I'm a banking consultant here in town. And I was struck by both Professor Hashimoto and Hayakawa in terms of kind of a real pessimism about, kind of depressing almost to hear this. And then I listened to Dr. Hane talk about, in response to another question of, what did it take to bring about change? And you cited 2 periods of time and said, in effect, they came in the aftermath of turmoil and chaos and so forth, which, of course, goes against the basic grain of Japanese society, at least in recent decades. My question is this, and I'm not sure who I'm really addressing it to, is if Dr. Hane is right, that, and I've heard other Japanese friends of mine say the same thing, it's going to take a crisis to really bring about a change, or at least more turmoil than we have seen now before things kind of accelerate. Is this something that the 2 professors would agree with, that it's going to take a shock to the system of some kind to bring about change fast enough so that, for instance, this young lady can have a job before retirement age? Or is the progress being made fast enough that it won't take a kind of traumatic, chaotic situation, such as Dr. Hane talked about, to bring about some really meaningful change along the lines that you all are talking about?
Just a quick response to that is that characteristic of the 2 periods that Dr. Hane was speaking about, there was nothing you had to break down before you built. The first time around, there was a major restoration. Japan was basically moving from feudal society to modern society. A nation-state building was occurring. So there was no real industrial infrastructure that needed to be reorganized. Everything had to be built from scratch. Likewise, in 1945, it was rebuilt because, well, we know what happened until 1945. All the social infrastructures and the social institutions had to be revised. Now is different. And I don't know if Dr. Hane would agree with me on this, is that the old is still there. The old institutions are there, and the stakeholders of the old institutions are also still there. And so there's something that needs to be torn down before something new is built. And I think that would take either a drastic revolution, as Dr. Hayakawa was saying, or a more gradual reformist, a conservative type of change, which may knock down fewer, maybe less hazardous to our health, but take longer to do.
One of the criticisms of the reforms is that they are too piecemeal.
I mean, if the more turmoil would be good for generating more ventures, and it's not happening that way, and the reform is piecemeal, and that's the pace at which change will occur. Yeah. But it is, in this sector, it is occurring.
Okay, we have a lot of questions. I think the next one was in the corner, gentleman in the corner. Thank you.
Want to make sure. My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and I'm with Masaoka Associates, and I want to speak on behalf of the junior high school kids in Japan. 10 years ago, the World Bank sent me to Japan, and my daughter went to junior high school, Toho Gakuen, which is a nice, well-known private junior high school. And there were 47 kids in her class. And so that meant that, and it wasn't unusual, I was told, that meant that the class was always one-way traffic. Teacher speaks, and there's absolutely no time or leeway for commenting or raising questions, so forth. Well, my daughter learned in the period, memorized the Hyakunin issue and everything else, and came out of it, luckily, after 3 years. But now, today, there are 50% less kids, but there's no sign that the classrooms are smaller. And in another few years, there will be half as many kids as there were in 1993 in junior high school. And perhaps it's time for the classes to be only 20 kids. And you did not address anything about the class size or the way classes are operated. The other point you also, Dr. Hayakawa mentioned about junior high school kids not having homeworks. Indeed, my daughter did not have any homework because the time was allocated for kids to go to juku, which everybody else did. So perhaps in your statistics about how much time they spent in studies, the 3 or 4 hours per day that kids spend after school for parents to contribute all that money to the education industry should also be counted, because the kids have no time, really. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned two things. One thing is a class size, and the other thing is a cram school, juku school. As for the class size, the number of children is really decreasing. We have been a student shortage crisis in the year 2009, especially at that time. Many colleges and universities will face a financial crisis because of the enrollment shortage. The number will be almost half, compared with 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And it also affects the class size of the elementary school, junior high schools. And now still some classes are filled with more than 40 students. But gradually the class size of elementary school and junior high schools are getting smaller. But it is often said that Japanese average teachers like a bigger class than smaller class.
Why?
That's kind of groupism, More student in the classroom, more spirit in the classroom. This is a kind of tradition we had, but now because of so many classroom disruptions, disorders, Japanese teachers like to have small classes. They want to control their class, and also they want to teach individually. So that's what's going on now. And as for the cram schools, this is one of the typical educational culture we have in our country. And so many junior high school, elementary school kids and junior high school kids go to cram schools. And so many people, educators, criticize, the presence of cram schools as kind of evil things. But they have both a negative and positive aspect. They spend many hours over there, and they learn, basic patterns of learning, and they learn the habit of learning in those cram schools. So even the Minister of Education said, they expect the role of cram schools to supplement, what public schools can do.
Thank you. Yes, here in front.
I'm Tom Blea, and I'm writing a book in which one of the chapters is about innovation in the United States and Japan. And a question for Dr. Hane, if I might. I had interviewed Sachio Senmoto a couple of years ago in Japan, who founded e-access, as you pointed out. And since that time, I've looked at a number of entrepreneurs, and some of them were shown in your third slide, I guess, about entrepreneurs. And I asked Senmoto-san, who was one of the very few people in Japan who was taught entrepreneurship at Keio. I asked how his classes were. Did he have a lot of entrepreneurs in his class? He said, no, very, very few. And in fact, he said one of the very few is sitting next to me, his aide. And I'd gotten to know his aide a bit before I talked with Senmoto-san, and his aide was pulled very reluctantly out of IBM Japan, which is not an obvious spot for entrepreneurs. So my question for you is, how many of not only the entrepreneurs that you've listed, but others that you're familiar with, have had some U.S. experience? Mm-hmm. And how many are really young people? There seems to be a real disconnect here between the young people that Hashimoto Sensei is talking about and the entrepreneurs that you're talking about. the young people I spoke with in Japan were more interested, maybe thinking about following their dream into hip hop, rather than one who did. But how about that? American experience and age levels of these entrepreneurs.
Which campus does he teach at, Semoto?
He taught at Keio.
Which campus, do you know? Is it Mita, Fujisawa? Where did you interview him?
I think SFC.
Was that Fujisawa? Okay, because there's another professor, Masumoto, who has his own venture capital firm, Academy Capital Investments, and he has a lot of entrepreneurs in his classes. So maybe it's the nature of the class. I'm not sure. But getting to your question about a lot of the people that I've spoken with have international exposure. Maybe certainly the majority. And I haven't. This is not a scientific sampling. It's just in the course of my work, I talk to a lot of people, and that seems to have inspired them to think about things in a more energetic and different way. It seems to be very important, and they identify it as being very important, not my observation. Again, with this youth split, if it's nice to have. Well, one of the this is a bit of an aside. One of the problems you face as a young person is there are a lot of expectations of a young person coming out of a prestigious college by one's family and by one's sort of social surroundings. I asked one young Keio recent Keio graduate if she or her friends would consider marrying an entrepreneur, and they said no way. What I want to do is marry a guy who works for a big corporation. So there are sort of social issues out there that would get people to think, to lean toward the established paths because they are proven paths to success for people from the big schools. That being said, there are, I think, a lot of examples of younger people who, the thing about young people, they don't really plan to work in the same corporation for the rest of their lives. So what are they going to do? They're going to rely on this liberalization that seems to be in the corporations that seems to be occurring very slowly, or are they going to, keep a closer eye out on how small companies come and go and what role they might have in those? I can think of a number of examples of young people who have quit good jobs to go work in ventures. And then older people. At Matsushita, they, a couple of years ago, had an early retirement program for people just over 50. They expected 1,000 people to take up early retirement. 13,000 people took early retirement. So there are a lot of people out there that are looking for something else to do. They have at least 20 years of good, productive life. The problem is in between, because you have people in their late 30s, early 40s. Then you're kind of stuck because you're maybe giving up more in terms of your promotion possibilities, your pensions, or other things like that. So it seems to me that's where there's more of an issue, is in your early 30s, early 30s, mid 40s kind of range with ventures than in the older, younger ventures.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions here. Here in the middle.
Hi, James Hathaway from the Department of State. A comment and a question. I tend to have a much rosier picture of Japan than the one, at least Professor Hayakawa and Dr. Hashimoto are presenting today. Speaking strictly from personal experience, I find that the Japanese over the last decade have become incredibly entrepreneurial. I have friends in their 30s and 40s who have quit their third job to retire and turn their 6-tatami apartment into a small cafe, a flower shop, clothing stores, bars, pubs, restaurants, you name it. The alleyways of Tokyo now to me seem almost like Venice. They're very romantic, and every apartment has a different thriving business in it, and people are really taking these chances. And these people are now seen, at least my impression is, by their counterparts who are salarymen or still stuck in the rigidity of the tate shakai. They're the object of envy. That, look at my friend who's quit his job and he has this thriving restaurant. So I think that entrepreneurship and creativity is really thriving. One of my questions is, these are both about incentives. One of the incentives being in the education system. And it seems to me that throughout high school, your incentive is the examination to get yourself into college. Having gone to a Japanese university myself, I can tell you that a number of my classmates and colleagues, by the time they got into college, it was a 4-year vacation. They'd passed the examination. And they were just waiting for 4 years to study their sonkeigo and their polite forms so they could pass the interview to get into the companies they were going to work for. And so this is long-winded, I know, but my question is, are there any specific reforms being talked about in the testing system in Japanese schools to change those incentives?
Yeah, I should mention that. As for the test system, especially college entrance examination, because of the criticism raised to the this leeway policy raised by the Minister of Education, there is a tendency toward a tightening of college entrance examination system. Even though, for example, a national university, for the national universities, high school students should take twice for the entrance examination, one held in January, the second one held in February and March. Last week, I finished my undergraduate, college entrance examination finally. Last Friday was, time for interview for 12th graders, and maybe within 2-3 years, those top elite universities like Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, Nagoya, we're going to adopt the tougher college entrance examination systems. So the first standardized examination system, all the students have to take that system. But after that, those high school, those applicants have to take each university's examination. That is regarded as more important than the first one. And in that second examination, each university is going to require really, to solve those difficult problems. And this is what top elite universities are going to do. So they are interested in selecting, really top, students. So as I mentioned, there is a kind of tendency between tendency of bipolarization between those who only for the selected few and the average, student. Maybe who they don't have to study very hard, they'll be allowed to be enrolled in some colleges, within several years. So this is a kind of bipolarization is happening in terms of college entrance examination.
Is it also the case, Professor Hayakawa, that there's more variation in the second exam now with interviews, with essays?
Oh, that's right, that's right. That's really interesting. We have examination for 2 times, one in February and March, and one in February and the other in March. Usually, for the first time, we accept almost 70 to 80% of our applicants. And then for the second time, we save only 20 or 30%. So majority of the applicants will be finishing their examination at the first time. So the time for interviews and other personal essays, the chances are really getting slim.
Okay, I think the next question was over here. Gerald?
My name is Teruo Iwai. I came from the Mansfield Foundation. Thank you very much for your presentations. My question is about the teachers. You all talk about the creativity and the entrepreneurship, and seems like it's going to be taught at school. But my experience is that if teachers don't know what being creative is, I don't think it's teachable. This is a very good example. I went to Japanese schools from kindergarten to college, and I was taught English by non-English speakers. And the result is I learned English in this country since I came here, right? So, well, my point is I don't think those who don't know what this is cannot teach that. And well, my question is there any initiative in any schools or ministries or any place that's going to hire more creative people in schools? Thank you.
Well, as for the employment of new teachers, in our country, it's getting very difficult for them to be employed as a teacher, public school teachers. And to pass that teacher employment examination, this is also examination, a time for examination. they have to study a lot of subject, general education and their specific subject, and also some knowledge on education, psychology. So they have to be really smart. In that sense, they may be highly intelligent, but they may not be so creative. They know how to, adapt to the examination system, but they are not very well trained to develop such kind of new type of curriculum, like experiential learning, comprehensive type of learning. So for most of the teachers, what is creative is to be really intelligent. So that's really difficult to say, and so we need to change this kind of employment, teacher employment system.
Are there any reforms right now that are addressing this problem that you are aware of?
Well, actually, as for the teacher education program, it is getting tighter. They have to learn more about education, psychology, their own subject. That's what's happening.
Right, but if I could add, it seems to me, though, if you really are valuing putting this creativity and experiential learning into the school system, then you have precedents. For example, hiring foreigners as teachers. Maybe they're not on the same track as Japanese citizens, but you could invest in people who have this expertise.
Right.
And I guess I don't see that that's happening yet, but it could be a direction for the future.
That's right. Even elementary school children will start learning English maybe in the year 2008, and each school district employs so many foreigners as an English teacher, and also the Ministry of Education allowed each school to employ business people as a principal, and they want to have more discretion. And maybe they will have a chance to employ a new type of teachers for more entrepreneur type.
But then there is
yes, please.
But then there is the problem of the non-creative teachers not liking the creative teachers. and you see, it's not as simple as bringing in a role model and saying, okay, here's a creative person, follow suit. If you are not so creative yourself, you're not going to like that, and you're not going to change the status quo. It's the same with introduction of English speakers with terrific accents. That was humiliating to teachers who did not have those skills, and that took a long time to integrate into the schools. So I think wherever there is a new program, there's also going to be resistance, and that is the tug of war that we deal with in everyday reality. And so it's not as rosy perhaps as we would like it to be, and that may take me back to the more pessimist scenario that a gentleman commented earlier on. But I think that there is resistance as well, probably.
Yeah. Well, I think, but as for the teachers, I think there are various type of teachers. Some are really emphasizing, college entrance examinations. Others really emphasize, more fun, like, experiential learning. They spend more time for music. They spend more time for playing, Go or Shogi. So that's what, that's why so-called a comprehensive type of learning is introduced to let the students enjoy their school cultures.
I do have one question for Dr. Hane. I was wondering if you could address the brain drain that Japan is suffering from now. Japan never suffered from a brain drain in all the years of its history until now. And Leonard Chopa writes about the exit phenomenon taking place on all levels of Japanese society, and it seems like the most creative individuals just exit Japan altogether. And perhaps also Dr. Hashimoto could comment on this, since she went to a very creative school, is a very creative individual, and she now is in Pittsburgh.
Well, but in terms of U.S.-Japan, they usually go back to Japan, right? I mean, there are very few Japanese that actually take U.S. citizenship. That I guess maybe some that take green cards while they're here. When Exiting Japan for some periods, again, seems to be a very important thing to do. I mean, Shuji Nakamura, who's a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and was the inventor of the blue laser, and who recently won a suit against his old company for $180 million, was asked by a group of Tokyo University students, Professor Nakamura, you've had this great creative career. What advice can you give these students to inspire them to follow a similar path? And he said, well, if you stay in Japan, it's impossible. And he said, so you leave Japan, go somewhere else, study, challenge yourself, recalibrate your perspective in your mind, and then come back. And I guess I don't know the statistics for staying in Japan and staying out of Japan, but the Japanese I know at some point want to go back. So, yeah, sorry.
I think the exit phenomenon is fine. It's not a problem, and I think if there is more of it, there might be some other entries from other places that will be tolerated. It's time to break the mold of the homogeneous society. And I do think, though, that there is a tendency for those people who have been through a more liberal education or a different type of education than what the public school offers to leave Japan, and that is due to multiple factors, including language as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say that that is a large phenomenon as an exit phenomenon. I do think, though, that, and this is from my experience in working for the United Nations for 5 years, was that predominantly the successful Japanese women who were in these international organizations were women, and that is in part because this is a meritocratic, relatively meritocratic system that allowed for these women to succeed without being encumbered by specific glass ceilings. And so I do think that that creativities can lead to open different doors, and if those doors are outside the border, take it. And I don't see a real problem with that. And I think we are no longer really living in the age where being able to go back or not being able to go back should matter too much. And that is probably going to be increasing the case for Japanese women, I would say, more than men, probably. You agree?
Yeah, I would think so.
Mhm.
Yeah, because that's where the opportunity structure is.
Yes, here in front, in the middle.
Takaki Isano, Development Bank of Japan. I have a question for Dr. Hashimoto. I thought you said, I know I'm just oversimplifying what you said, but traditionally paternalistic nature of the Japanese society has to some degree contributed to the sense of social suffocation or the loss of confidence on the part of the Japanese teens, and eventually leading to the lower rate of the youth aspiring to be the entrepreneurs. If that's the case, why do you think the South Korean teens, whose society are known to be far more hierarchical or paternalistic than the Japanese one?
I'm afraid I'm not an expert on Korean society, so there's a limited degree to which I could address the question. But I don't think that the kind of problem, the issues that we're dealing with is monocausal, and therefore demographics, paternalism, the job structure, and a host of other things probably matter as well. And I would also say that I don't necessarily see, having said a whole lot of pessimistic things, I would also add that I'm not necessarily terribly alarmed about the state of young people today, in the sense that if they don't want to excel, that's their prerogative. I think it was Professor Morishima who said that, England has a lot of A+ students and Japan has a lot of B students. When he was comparing the college students in England and in Japan in his experience, and if the Japanese are happy and capable of doing what they want to do with a lot of B students, that's, I don't think, is necessarily a problem. And so if we have some people who excel in entrepreneurial skills, some others who want to be house husbands, and others. I think that is what we would like to be able to have, to be able to follow your aspirations regardless of what those aspirations might necessarily be. What I find problematic is the sense that your aspiration has to be this or that, achievement of this, or excelling in business, or whatever else that might be. That's what I find problematic, and I don't know how Korean society would deal with those various different aspects of the work.
Can I add one thing?
Mm-hmm.
I visited Korea last December, and I found an interesting data about divorce.
Mm.
Divorce rate in Korea is number 2 in the world. And both Japan and Korea are, highly hierarchical and paternalistic. But our culture is more group-oriented. On the contrary, Korean culture is more individualistic-oriented. That's one of the reasons why, there's a high rate of divorce among Korean people. This is my hypothesis. I don't know.
Korea also has a high percentage of Christians in the society, and historically they've had a whole lot more of social revolts that have been successful through the students' youth movement. So the overthrow of authority or challenging of authority has a more sedimented history in the Korean case. And there, I think the societies are quite different probably historically in more ways than one. But those are just guesses.
And I think you also could ask the question of whether these are younger sons or eldest sons who are more entrepreneurial, and also what percentage of the population relied upon large corporations for security, but compared to what percentage of the Japanese population, and for how long. Mm-hmm. Just things to think about.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I think you've been waiting the longest here in the front here. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Romi Sato. I'm self-employed in IT business, which means I don't belong to anything. We talked a lot about education system in junior high school, elementary, and college. And I agree that the education system in Japan is contributing a lot of the problems of hindering the creativity in Japanese students and children. However, I would also think that the continuing education area is also one of the areas we have to look into. Not only students, but also mid-career workers sometimes need to go back to school, and then I believe school is not the only source to create your creativity. However, sometimes you need some time to think what you can do, what you want to do, to go through that kind of ideas. And for example, like here, there is a business school and then a graduate school that people come back after 10 years, 20 years of work experience, which I do not see in Japan. And Dr. Hashimoto and or Dr. Hayakawa, do you have any thoughts on continuing education in Japan?
Yeah. Maybe I should mention that it's a really new challenge for Japanese, colleges and universities. Maybe within several years, we'll face a financial crisis. We mean Japanese colleges and universities will face a financial crisis because of the shortage of students. We have to look for a new client. Maybe that's adult learners. That's one of the really challenge for us too, to develop really attractive, educational program for adults. Adult learners are really, severe in terms of evaluating the quality of educational programs. I teach at the University of the Air. We call it Air. That's kind of adult education programs, and those students age range from 18 years old to 78, 79. I really enjoy teaching over there. But as for the usual average, college professors, it's not fun to teach a mixture of different type of students. But it is really important for us, to develop such kind of new programs to attract huge number of potential learners, and that's one of the challenge for us too, I think.
I think that continuing education is key to the importance of giving second and third chances in a more open job market. You have to be able to go in and out of the training programs and training institutions as well as the job market to renew yourself, to retool yourself. And so in that sense, I would hope that Japanese universities would create more opportunities for what we call the non-traditional students in this country.
Right. That's really difficult, though.
Yes, actually, we're going to take just one more comment. Yes.
You can give me 2 minutes. I just want to tell you my experience about entrepreneurial. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to spend 2 minutes to tell you my experience at, on the entrepreneurship education in Japan. I gave the lecture on the entrepreneurship in Japan, in the United States, Waseda, Tokyo Keizai Daigaku, and Musashino Joshi Daigaku. They're all in Tokyo. And for my business, to bring Japanese college kids to the United States for entrepreneurship training, I did some research on which universities or colleges in Japan are providing entrepreneurship programs. There are 100+ universities and colleges in Japan which provide entrepreneurship programs. And some of them are, surprisingly, women's college and Bukkyo universities, such as, Ryukoku, Bukkyo University in Kyoto, and then so on and so forth. So that means there are increasing number of universities in Japan which provides the entrepreneurship programs. And also, I have my question on this because many of the faculty members are traditional professors who do not have any entrepreneurship business experience, which gave me some impression that maybe these lifetime teaching faculties may give us some theoretical framework, but they don't have any risk-taking spirit, no concept about the second chance by the losers, which they have never been through. So they should have some combination with practitioners like businessmen, others in business, industrial areas, so that you can have a combination of theory and practices. So in that sense, I think it is very important to have internships along with classroom teaching. Thank you.
Okay, let's get some final comments. Dr. Hane, can you learn to be an entrepreneur in school, or?
Can you learn to be an entrepreneur in school? Well, I mean, that shift that you're describing, and I didn't realize there were over 100, although I guess if you count technology management programs, there's been a recent proliferation of these programs. It's a very positive thing to sensitize individuals to the kinds of issues you deal with in entrepreneurship. And as you know, in the national university system, which there were 98, 99 universities, only one has a business school, right, Hitotsubashi. And so, but I understand more universities are thinking about developing business schools. And in U.S. universities, there's often an important business school, engineering school, science school kind of synergy that occurs that unfortunately you don't have as much in Japan. So those kind of things can certainly be helpful. Can you teach an entrepreneur? That's one thing that would be helpful to teach entrepreneurs. Obviously, there's more that goes into being a successful entrepreneur than just the education. But certainly, learning some of the basic skills would be very good. And we deal with, just as one final comment, in my work, we're dealing with scientists who are trying to spin off, create ventures right now. We're dealing with some scientists from a university close to Professor Hayakawa's, who has a great piece of scientific advance. But there's a long way between the scientific advance and then a viable business. And they have no idea what that is. And so if you can at least explain to people in these settings what's involved in taking your discovery into the commercial marketplace, then that would also be helpful in facilitating the formation and success of businesses.
Okay, we're about out of time, so unless there are any final words from... Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming today, and I ask you to join me in a round of applause for our panel. And if you would definitely like to receive one of our special reports, if you just give me your card, I'll be sure and put one in the mail for you. Thank you.
You're here for a while? Oh, no, I'm leaving for New York.
How are you?
You're in the training, right?
Oh, you like this?
Struggle, is that right? Right. Which year were you in?
But in my next life, I'm going to look at the very young people in Japan. I'm only going to write a short piece.